One man, one night, 50 prisoners, and no backup. The year was 1944, and somewhere along the frozen German frontier, a single soldier was about to disobey a direct order from his commanding officer, slip into enemy territory, alone, and return with a column of Wehrmacht soldiers so long that his own men thought they were being counterattacked. His superiors had forbidden the mission. His fellow soldiers thought he was insane. But what he did that night would force the entire Allied command structure to reconsider everything they thought they knew about warfare, courage, and the terrifying effectiveness of one man willing to operate outside every rule ever written. This is not a story about a famous general. It is not about a decorated hero whose name appears in every history book. It is about a soldier whose actions were so unusual, so borderline reckless, that the military establishment did not know whether to court-martial him or pin a medal on his chest. And it begins not with glory, but with frustration, cold, and the maddening reality that sometimes the only way to win is to ignore everything you have been. The Western Front in late 1944 was not the sweeping advance that newsreels back home suggested. After the breakout from Normandy, after the liberation of Paris, after the optimism of summer had faded into autumn rain, the Allied armies found themselves grinding against an enemy that refused to collapse. The Germans were retreating, yes, but they were retreating in good order, blowing bridges, laying mines, turning every river and every tree line into a new defensive position. The war that was supposed to be over by Christmas was now looking like it might drag on into another year, and the men in the foxholes could feel it in their bones. Somewhere in this landscape of mud and misery, along a sector where American and German positions faced each other across a few hundred yards of frozen ground, a young officer was becoming increasingly frustrated with the way the war was being fought. His name does not matter as much as what he represented. He was not a West Point graduate. He had not grown up dreaming of military glory. He was a citizen soldier, thrust into leadership by the demands of total war, and he had developed a very specific belief about how to win battles. Butzus. He believed that waiting was worse than acting. He believed that the enemy was just as cold, just as tired, just as confused as his own men, and that the side that struck first, struck hardest, and struck unexpectedly would be the side that survived. His commanding officers did not share this belief. They had a plan, and the plan involved patience, coordination, and waiting for the right moment to launch a properly supported offensive. Night raids were discouraged. Solo operations were forbidden. The doctrine was clear. No one goes into enemy territory without a patrol, without a radio, without a clear extraction plan. The reasoning was sound. One man alone could not accomplish anything meaningful, and the risk of losing even a single experienced officer to a pointless solo mission was unacceptable when every life mattered. But this particular officer had been watching the German positions for weeks. He knew their routines. He knew when they rotated sentries, when they brought up supplies, when their officers made inspections. He had studied the terrain until he could picture every ditch, every hedgerow, every shell crater in his mind. And he had come to a conclusion that his superiors would have considered insane. The Germans were vulnerable, not because they were weak, but because they believed their positions were secure. They did not expect a single man to come for them. They did not expect anyone to be foolish enough to try. The idea began as a thought experiment. He was behind them now, moving through their rear areas, and the few soldiers he encountered were so convinced that they were safe that they did not even look in his direction. So, he passed supply dumps, past communication trenches, past bunkers where officers were sleeping off the exhaustion of another day of war. And with each step, his plan became clearer. He was not here to kill. He was here to capture. And the best way to capture German soldiers was to make them believe that resistance was pointless. He needed them to think that they were surrounded, that fighting would only get them killed, that surrender was the smart choice. But to do that, he needed to create a moment of overwhelming psychological pressure, a moment when their training collapsed and their survival instincts took over. He found his opportunity at a small command post tucked into a ravine. There were perhaps a dozen soldiers inside, gathered around a map table, discussing the day's orders. A single sentry stood outside, smoking a cigarette, his rifle leaning against the wall. The officer watched him for a long moment, calculating angles and distances. Then, without hesitation, he moved. The sentry never saw him coming. One moment he was alone. The next there was a hand over his mouth and a voice in his ear, speaking in rough German, telling him to stay quiet, to cooperate, to live. The sentry froze, his body rigid with fear, and the officer relieved him of his weapon, then pushed him gently toward the entrance of the command post. The sentry stumbled forward, glanced back once, and then seemed to make a decision. He raised his hands and walked inside. What happened next unfolded so quickly that the Germans inside barely had time to react. The officer followed the sentry through the entrance, weapon raised, and barked a command in German. Hands up. Nobody move. The soldiers inside looked at him, looked at each other, and in that moment of confusion, the psychological advantage shifted. They did not know how many men were outside. They did not know if this was the vanguard of a larger assault. All they knew was that an American soldier was standing in their command post with a weapon pointed at them, and that resistance might mean death. One by one, they raised their hands. The officer motioned them outside, keeping his weapon trained on the group, his voice calm and authoritative. He did not shout. He did not threaten. He simply gave orders, and the Germans obeyed because obeying felt safer than fighting. Within minutes, he had a dozen prisoners standing in the fog, hands on their heads, looking around nervously as if expecting more American soldiers to emerge from the darkness. But there were no more soldiers. There was only him. Now came the hard part. He had prisoners, but he was still deep inside enemy territory, surrounded by German positions, with no backup and no clear route back to his own lines. If he tried to march them back the way he had come, they would almost certainly be spotted, and the fragile illusion of control would shatter. If the prisoners realized he was alone, they might decide that 12 men could easily overpower one. He needed to keep them moving, keep them off balance, keep them convinced that cooperation was their best chance of survival. He chose a route that took them along the edge of the German positions, staying in the low ground, using the fog as cover. He kept his voice low, kept his weapon visible, kept moving with the confidence of a man who knew exactly what he was doing, even though every step was an improvisation. The prisoners shuffled along in silence, their boots crunching on the frozen ground, their breath misting in the cold air, and as they moved, something unexpected began to happen. They encountered more German. Small groups, isolated sentries, soldiers who were caught off guard by the sight of a column of their own men being marched through the fog by an American officer. And each time the officer used the same tactic. He barked commands, gestured with his weapon, and added the new prisoners to the group. The Germans complied because they could see their comrades complying, because the fog made it impossible to know how many Americans were really out there, because fear and confusion are more powerful than training. The column grew. 15 prisoners, 20, 30. The officer moved among them, keeping them in line, keeping them moving, his mind racing as he tried to figure out how he was going to get this many men back to his own lines without getting shot by nervous American sentry. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, the knowledge that one mistake, one moment of hesitation, would turn this audacious gamble into a catastrophe. But he did not hesitate. He kept moving. By the time he reached the edge of German-held territory, he had more than 40 prisoners. They formed a long, winding column that stretched back into the fog, a surreal procession of enemy soldiers being led through their own lines by a single American officer who should not have been there at all. He paused at the edge of no man's land, looking back at the column, then forward toward the American positions. This was the most dangerous moment. If the American sentries saw the column and thought it was a German counterattack, they would open fire. He needed to signal his identity, needed to make sure his own men understood what was happening. He called out in English, identifying himself, telling the sentries not to shoot. There was a long, tense silence. Then a voice called back, confused, asking him to repeat. He did, louder this time, and slowly, cautiously, he began leading the column forward. The American sentries emerged from their positions, weapons raised, staring in disbelief at the sight unfolding before them. One man, 50 German prisoners. No backup, no explanation that made any sense. The officer reached the American lines and turned the prisoners over to the stunned soldiers, who had no idea what to do with them. Word spread quickly. Officers appeared, demanding to know what had happened. The soldier who had disobeyed orders, who had launched a solo raid into enemy territory, who had captured more prisoners in one night than some entire companies had captured in weeks, stood there covered in mud and exhaustion, trying to explain what he had done and why. The initial reaction was not gratitude. It was anger. He had violated direct orders. He had put himself at enormous risk. He had operated completely outside the established chain of command. If he had been killed, it would have been a needless loss. If he had been captured, he could have compromised intelligence. The fact that he had succeeded did not change the fact that his actions were reckless, unpredictable, and impossible to replicate. the kind of thing that could not be tolerated in a modern army. But then the intelligence officers began interrogating the prisoners. And as they did, the value of what had been accomplished became clear. These were not just ordinary soldiers. Among the 50 prisoners were several officers, men who had detailed knowledge of German defensive plans, supply routes, and unit dispositions. The information they provided was invaluable, the kind of intelligence that could not be obtained through aerial reconnaissance or signal intercept. It was the kind of intelligence that saved lives, that allowed Allied commanders to plan attacks with greater precision, that shortened the war by days or weeks or more. The anger gave way to confusion, and the confusion gave way to a grudging respect. What this soldier had done was not supposed to work. Every military doctrine, every lesson from every war college said that solo operations were ineffective and dangerous. But he had proven that sometimes, in the right circumstances, with the right combination of preparation and audacity, one person could accomplish what an entire platoon could not. And that realization forced the command structure to ask uncomfortable questions about whether the rules they had written were always the right rules to follow. The story spread through the ranks. Soldiers who had been skeptical of aggressive tactics began to wonder if maybe there was something to this approach. Officers who had dismissed night raids as too risky started reconsidering. The impact was not immediate, and it was not universal, but it was real. One mission, conducted by one man who refused to accept the conventional wisdom, had changed the conversation about what was possible, but the soldier himself did not become famous. The military establishment was not ready to publicly celebrate someone who had disobeyed orders, even if the results had been extraordinary. He returned to his position, returned to the daily grind of war, and the night raid that had captured 50 Germans became just another story, one of thousands, that would be forgotten by everyone except the men who had been there. Years later, after the war ended, after the soldiers went home, and the foxholes were reclaimed by grass and wildflowers, the story resurfaced. Historians digging through after-action reports found references to the raid, found the interrogation transcripts from the prisoners, found the scattered documentation of what had happened that foggy night in late 1944. They pieced together the details, tried to understand how it had been possible, tried to extract lessons that could be taught to future generations of soldiers. But the more they studied it, the more they realized that this was not a story that could be reduced to a lesson plan. It was a story about a specific moment, a specific person, and a specific set of circumstances that could never be perfectly replicated. What made the raid work was not just the tactic, it was the psychological warfare, the ability to make the enemy believe something that was not true. The Germans had surrendered not because they were outnumbered, but because they thought they had complied, not because resistance was impossible, but because resistance seemed pointless. The officer had understood something fundamental about human nature, that fear and uncertainty are more powerful than physical force, and that creating the illusion of overwhelming power can be more effective than possessing actual overwhelming power. This understanding did not come from a textbook. It came from experience, observation, and a willingness to think differently. The officer had spent weeks studying the enemy, not just their positions, but their behavior, their morale, their routines. He had looked for weaknesses that were not obvious, weaknesses that existed in the mind rather than in the defenses. And when he found those weaknesses, he exploited them with a precision that no amount of firepower could have matched. But there was a darker side to the story as well, one that the histories often glossed over. The raid succeeded because the officer was willing to take risks that most people would consider insane. He was willing to walk into enemy territory alone, knowing that if anything went wrong, no one would be able to help him. He was willing to gamble his life on the assumption that the Germans would react in a certain way, and if that assumption had been wrong, he would have died. The line between courage and recklessness is often thinner than we like to admit, and the officer had walked that line without a safety net. There were moments during the raid when everything could have collapsed. If one of the prisoners had decided to fight, if one of the German sentries had been more alert, if the fog had lifted and exposed the column to observation, the entire operation would have ended in disaster. The officer had been lucky, and he knew it. Luck is not a strategy, and luck cannot be taught. What he had done was not a model for how wars should be fought. It was an exception, a statistical outlier, a reminder that sometimes the rules are wrong, and sometimes breaking them is the only way to win. The prisoners themselves had their own version of the story. For them, the night had been a nightmare of confusion and fear. They had been captured not by a superior force, but by a single man who had moved through their lines like a phantom, collecting them one by one, creating the illusion of an overwhelming assault without firing more than a few shots. Some of them felt humiliated. Others felt relieved. The war was over for them, and that meant they would survive. They would see their families again. They would not have to spend another frozen night in a foxhole wondering if tomorrow would be their last. The officer who had captured them had given them a strange kind of gift, even though he had been their enemy. The American soldiers who had been skeptical of the raid, who had thought it was a pointless gesture, began to see it differently as the weeks passed. The intelligence gathered from the prisoners helped guide future operations. Attacks that might have failed succeeded because commanders knew where the German defenses were weakest. Lives were saved because the element of surprise was used effectively. The raid had not won the war, but it had contributed to winning the war, and that contribution could not be measured in medals or commendations. It could only be measured in the soldiers who came home, who survived because someone had been willing to take a crazy risk on a foggy night in late 1944. The officer himself rarely spoke about the raid after the war. When asked, he would shrug, downplay what he had done, insist that he had just been doing his job. But those who knew him understood that the raid had changed him. It had shown him something about himself, about what he was capable of when everything was on the line. It had also shown him the cost of that kind of courage, the way it isolated you from the people around you, the way it made you different, in a way that could never be undone. He had gone into enemy territory alone, and even though he had come back, some part of him had stayed there in the fog, moving through the darkness, gambling everything on a plan that should not have worked. The real legacy of the raid was not the prisoners or the intelligence or the small tactical advantage it provided. The real legacy was the question it forced people to ask. What else is possible? The military establishment had built a system based on rules, on procedures, on the belief that coordinated action was always better than individual initiative, and for the most part, that belief was correct. Wars are won by logistics, by combined arms, by the ability to project overwhelming force at the decisive point. But the raid had shown that there were moments, rare and fleeting, when one person could do what an army could not. When the willingness to ignore the rules, to trust your own judgment, to walk into the darkness alone, could accomplish something that no amount of planning or coordination could achieve. This was not a lesson that could be taught in a classroom. It was a lesson that could only be learned through experience, through the kind of pressure that strips away everything except the essential question of whether you are willing to act when action seems impossible. Most people would say no. Most people would wait for orders, would defer to authority, would choose the safety of the group over the risk of standing alone, and most of the time, they would be right to do so. But sometimes the only way forward is to step outside the system, to become the exception, to prove that the rules are not as absolute as everyone believes. The soldier who captured 50 Germans alone understood this. He had looked at the situation, assessed the risks, and decided that the potential reward was worth the cost. He had been willing to fail, willing to die, willing to be wrong. And because he had been willing to accept those possibilities, he had achieved something that no one thought was possible. That is the essence of courage. Not the absence of fear, but the willingness to move forward despite the fear, to act when action seems insane, to trust yourself when everyone else is telling you that you are making a mistake. The war moved on. The fog lifted, the front lines shifted, and somewhere in the chaos of 1944, a single night raid faded into history, remembered by a handful of men who had been there, forgotten by everyone else. But the impact lingered. In the planning rooms where officers debated tactics, in the foxholes where soldiers weighed the cost of following orders against the cost of taking initiative, in the quiet moments when someone had to decide whether to play it safe or take a risk, the ghost of that raid was present. It was a reminder that the impossible is sometimes just the improbable waiting for someone brave enough to try. And so the story ends not with a triumphant return, not with a parade or a medal ceremony, but with a man standing in the mud, exhausted and cold, watching as the prisoners are led away. He had done what he set out to do. He had proven that it could be done. And now, every other soldier in every other war, he would return to his position and wait for the next mission, the next challenge, the next moment when someone would have to decide whether to follow the rules or break them. The difference was that now he knew what was possible. And that knowledge, more than any medal, was the real prize. Because once you know what you are capable of, once you understand that the limits you thought were absolute are actually negotiable, you can never go back to seeing the world the way you did before. The soldier who walked into enemy territory alone and came back with 50 prisoners had crossed a line, and there was no way to uncross it. He had become the exception, and in a war full of ordinary courage, that made him extraordinary.